Coming to you from Studio HQ, you're tuning into another Thinking the Extra coming to you from Comic Crusaders. I am Dodgy in the mix it with my amazing guest. But before I dive in, let's talk about our sponsors. Are you an aspiring comic creator but don't have the tools? Look no further than Thermond Comic Creations. There are sessions for different ages and different levels of experience. If the location is an issue, that is not an issue, as classes can be held digitally via Zoom. Jump on to thermondcomiccreations.com. And October 1st is Buy Indie Comics Day. If you're an indie creator like my guest today, reach out to your local comic book store, make it an event, celebrate local creators, and it's Artist Alley in your LCS. My special guest today is Alvaro Cortes Jr. Alvaro, how are you?
I'm doing so great. How are you doing today, Dodgy?
I'm good. I'm good. Man, I'm excited to check out what you're doing because, like, I've checked out the Duck website, which has like web comics, and you've been around a bit.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
yeah. So I mean, like, just talk about your the longevity you have because you've got some creations way back in 2007.
Oh
So it's
yeah.
15 years. I
Yeah.
mean, why? Like I guess the question is because people give up after 6 months or even 3 months, but 15 years. What is your juice? What keeps you going?
It's the love of the process and the love of the medium. I grew up reading comic books. I actually learned how to read because of comic books and picture books because I grew
Hmm.
up in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, and it was a way different Williamsburg back then. It was like if you've seen the movie Serpico, that's
Oh
the
yes.
Williamsburg that we're talking about. And
Wow.
my mother's Puerto Rican. She moved to New York as an adult, and she met my father, who's Mexican, and he had just moved to New York as well. He was working with a green card. They met, and I came around, and they both wanted me to grow up knowing English and Spanish. So
Hmm.
even though in the household we all spoke English, Spanish, they made us, my sister, I mean myself, watch English television. My father, even though he only just knew like the bare minimum to go by to work and such, he would still
Hmm.
buy comics and picture books and read them to me the best he could in English.
Oh.
So yeah. So that's kind of like what started that love for reading books and comics and graphic novels, and it never really left. Like it's been a part of my life as long as I remember.
Hmm. Yeah, and I mean, look, you've been around a bit. Like you've been, like you said, you're raised in Brooklyn, then you moved to Puerto Rico.
Yes.
But how was your affection to comics changing from location to location? Was it fairly the same, or what was
Uh,
that
it
like for you?
was it was actually quite different because growing up in New York and especially during the 80s,
Hmm.
when you were kind of like a geek, so to speak, back then you
Hmm.
were pretty much bullied for it,
Of
or
course,
you're like the outcast,
we
very
certainly
Stranger
were.
Things if you've seen it.
Yes.
Like it's no lie, like you were kind of like the outcast, like the weirdo if you were into comics and manga and anime and
Hmm.
animation. So I had friends, luckily enough, when I was growing up. Like I had like that weird kind of luck, I guess, where I got along with like the outcasts and the jocks and the nerds and whatnot.
Hmm.
And so I didn't really get bullied too bad. Like
Hmm.
when I would be, it would be kind of like more pertaining to that. And
Yeah.
then when I moved to Puerto Rico, I was already a preteen, and I went to a private school actually because my mother wanted me to go to like a quote unquote safer school because she was always very overprotective of me. And it was there where I actually found a handful of friends that were very much into comics as well. So it
Hmm.
was like that whole different culture of actually meeting other kids my age that were into comics, and they were so into comics that they learned to read and talk English because they were reading comics.
Yeah, but at the time, were there not comics translated into Spanish that were readily available, or were they all in English?
Oh yes, in Puerto Rico, like because there's a big publishing house in Mexico that they do a
Mm-hmm.
lot of Spanish translations for American comics like DC, Tom and Jerry, and all that good stuff. And a
Mm-hmm.
lot of my friends bought it, but there was usually a pretty big delay. So it wasn't like nowadays that was like
Mm-hmm.
same day or at least same month it would come out all published in the same
Mm-hmm.
in different languages. Like sometimes you would have to wait up to a year to like catch up. So a lot of my
Mm-hmm.
friends, they just were so excited about comic books, and in a lot of ways, it was their own escape as well. They just like
Mm-hmm.
dug right into whatever new issue came out at the time, like X-Men, Spider-Man, Batman, and that's kind of what I was starting to get into because growing up in New York, I was more into the kid comics since I was like more of a kid. So I
Mm-hmm.
was like reading Archie, Muppet Babies, and all that stuff. Then as
Mm-hmm.
a preteen, that's when I started really getting into Batman, especially after the Batman '89 movie.
Mm-hmm. No, of course. I think everyone was really into Batman at that time, no matter who you were, like, right?
Yes.
Like everyone wanted something, Batman T-shirt, Batman merchandise. But I do appreciate you bringing up Archie because I find that Archie's sort of like we always talk the big two, but it's nice to hear Archie being thrown in because my brother he would read Archie and I would read the not the adult stuff, but like Spider Man and Batman and whatnot. But it was nice to actually read his books for a change to get that bit of lighter humor. Did,
Yeah,
did you find
definitely.
the same? Do you still jump back to Archie at times?
Oh yes, like even in my stories, like sometimes there's like callbacks and homages. Like sometimes I'll like write something in one of my main web comics, Fred Peterson, the Mighty Warlord. Like
Mm-hmm.
if there's like some kind of like relationship problem or something, like the readers themselves will be like, "Man, I don't mean this as hate, but this really feels very Archie right now." I'm like,
No,
yes.
definitely, and that's exactly what you're wanting. So you started creating the fanzines in the early 2000s?
Yes, I started to like really get into comic books more like in the creative aspect when I was in that same private school because one of my friends and I we had kind of like a friendly rivalry like sometimes
Hmm.
you do in school. So
Of
we
course.
kind of like to try to one up each other like whether it was basketball, grades, spelling bee contests, like
Hmm.
you know, we were the definition of frenemies back then.
Hmm.
So
Nice.
I started kind of like creating my own characters, and he saw that, and he's like, "Well, I can do better." So he started creating his own characters, and before we knew it, we were like having these long conversations over the landline phones to one another, talking about creating stories and doing this and doing that, and
Hmm.
that's kind of how it started. And then by the time when I was in high school, since I did grow up reading Archie comics and all those other comics that weren't the big two, I've always had like that affinity to also read independent comics as well. So in high school, I also had started reading The Crow. I had started reading Wandering Star, Creed, Poison L's Box Office Poison. So I always had kind of like that mix between indie and mainstream as well. And of
Hmm.
course, Todd McFarlane blew my mind.
Of
So,
course.
like my introduction to Tom McFarlane was Spawn, since that was like at the age that I was starting to get into like the more adult comics, as you said. Because
Hmm.
even as a kid, like we'll be like, "Oh, Archie's like kid stuff. Like I like the adult stuff, like X-Men."
Hmm.
It's kind of like that mentality.
Yeah,
So,
that's right. Yeah, I was kind
so
of the same with Spawn. He was my introduction to McFarlane as well. I had to go back and read all the back issues of Spider Man.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Like that's pretty much what I would do too. And I also had another friend that was like the biggest collector out of all of us in that school, and he
Hmm.
was a huge Tom McFarlane fan to the point where everybody just found him obnoxious. And he just loved to troll all my other friends. Like every month, he would come with Wizard magazine and put it like in the lunch room table and be like, "See that, guys? Tom McFarlane #1 again, hot artist in the top 10." And it would rile everyone up good. It was fun times.
Definitely, definitely. I did cut you off. What was it that you were saying about the fanzine? So please continue your story with your fanzine.
Oh yes, of course. So I kind of like going through high school and then going to college. Like I was starting to take making comics more seriously.
Mm-hmm.
Also, like by then, the internet was a little more widely available, and people were like kind of
Mm-hmm.
seeing what could be done. So I was
Yeah.
kind of introduced to other people that would had done fanzines back in the '60s and '70s.
Mm-hmm.
So there was this one person called Tim Temmel.
Mm-hmm.
He was in charge of one of the divisions in the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, and he was
Okay.
doing zines to benefit that organization. So he would like do zines that would have superheroes kind of like related to cystic fibrosis and all that stuff. And he
Mm.
had put out
Wow.
like a search for talent to help contribute to those zines. So that was 2002. So I saw that like an opportunity to like, well, let me just put myself out there to see if I really can have what it takes to actually have the discipline to do a zine or a comic or whatnot. And on
Mm-hmm.
top of it is a good cause too. You know, so
Yeah.
I donated all that time and all the artwork and writing to doing different zines related to their stories and their universe. It was kind of like a superhero universe as well. And that kind of
Mm-hmm.
like gave me the confidence to like put my own things out there eventually as well.
Mm-hmm. And were you writer creator, or writer artist, or were you teaming up with anyone at that time?
Yeah, I was pretty much a writer artist. At first, I did do the illustration for a different writer because another illustrator was supposed to draw that story specifically. But
Mm-hmm.
since I had just come into it, like they decided for me to do the illustration for that as well. So actually, I
Mm-hmm.
started out, the first thing that got published was the art side, and then eventually I was doing both.
Nice, nice, nice. And how did it feel? Because eventually you went from thinking about it, wanting to do it, to actually do it. How did that feel?
It was like a rush of adrenaline actually, to be honest, like because
Mm-hmm.
again, I'm the type of person that I'm just in love with the process. Like even if I get frustrated and hate everything I do by the end and like be like,
Mm-hmm.
why did I choose this, like I just
Yeah.
still find the process fascinating. And then to see the end product is like, wow, it's actually done, you know, something that came from your mind is tangible right there in front of you.
Yeah. And then you went on to say that in 2006 is when you started self-publishing your own webcomic, Fred Patterson, the Mighty Warlord. Where did that idea come from? From the character?
The character pretty much came from those conversations that I had with my friends in middle school in that private school in Puerto Rico. He was one of the characters that I had created, and it was the one that I was kind of the most attached to in a way because that character was kind of like the embodiment of all my favorite comics at the time. So even from the moment I created it, it was almost like a love letter to my favorite comics, especially The Ray from the 1990s, written by Jack C. Harris and illustrated by Joe Quesada, Art Nichols, John
Hmm.
Cebollero. That was the comic that made me want to do comics, actually. And then
Hmm.
eventually, when they did the ongoing series briefly, it was written by Christopher Priest. And Christopher Priest is my all-time favorite comic book writer. So there's also a lot of influence from that. And also, it was my love letter to Archie as we were speaking, to the
Hmm.
point where one of the characters that's right there on the screen, the redhead Cheryl, like I thought I was so cool because I created that character that's basically his love interest in the first story arc. And then a while after I had created the series, I see Archie on Facebook promote a new Cheryl Blossom
Hmm.
comic, and it's a redhead also. I'm like, oh no, don't tell me. And when I look into it, like, sure enough, she was a character that was around since the 70s. So she must have
Yeah.
subconsciously been in my mind all that time too.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, to be honest with you, I mean, to have a redhead who has a bit of a bubbly personality, it's not originally, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's available everywhere.
Yeah, but in hindsight, I would have named her something different other than Cheryl also.
Yeah, true. Um, so it's 2006, still going today. I mean, I just want to pick your brain. Um, wh- what do you find in the story that, or what do you find to keep the story going like it is?
A lot of it, as I said, it's a love letter to the industry really, and to the comics that I read growing up. I was actually earlier in the week watching the previous Think Indie podcast with Dan Memblia, I believe his name
Yeah, yeah,
was.
Membiela, yes.
Yes. Sorry, I butchered your name, man. But I was watching it, and resonated some things that he said. Also, like in many ways, comic books also saved my life because it was
Mhm.
like a very difficult transition moving from New York to Puerto Rico at that age, especially
Yeah.
because I moved out in fifth grade. Like I didn't get to graduate elementary school with my friends, and
Hmm.
the reason was also because my mother wanted to wait for my sister to graduate high school for us to move to Puerto Rico so she could graduate with her friends. So already there was kind of a conflict there. And then, like, the whole culture clash of being somewhere new, relearning everything. And thankfully, even though I knew Spanish pretty good and I actually knew how to read it because of just that, because of my parents kind of training me all this time to know both languages. And I actually read a
Hmm.
lot of Mexican and Latin American comics like Condorito and comics like Memin, which are like classic Latin American comics as well. Still, it
Hmm.
was like a very difficult transition for me. So a lot of times, like, comics was my escape too.
Mm. No, great. Um and I want to go back a bit. So you have an associate degree in fine arts and have studied the School of Visual Arts under comic book legends Phil Jimenez and Carl Jansen. How was that? How was it? What was that like working with legends?
It was absolutely mind blowing, especially because at my age, I was always the oldest guy in the class.
Mm-hmm.
Like, aside from the professors. So it was also kind of like that like whole other kind of culture shock in a different way. And
Mm-hmm.
I was able to, like, put that aside, and all the students were very cool as well. All my classmates, I actually still am in contact with a lot of them. I'm actually still in contact with Phil Jimenez and, to an extent, Klaus Jansen as well.
Mm-hmm.
And it was mind blowing learning from them because being self trained all this time, you kind of learn to do it one specific way. But then you
Mm-hmm.
encounter this classroom, and you're standing in front of these, like, legends in my eyes, and then I have to, like, basically relearn everything because then you're kind of learning, like, the industry standard of how to do
Mm-hmm.
things in a more commercial way.
Yes.
So it was a bit of a struggle at first, um,
Mm-hmm.
especially with Klaus Jansen. Like, he's like a super straight shooter. Like, he
Oh
doesn't
yeah.
sugarcoat anything for anyone, whether it be student or another professional. And sometimes, like, when I would hand in my early assignments, he would be like, Alvaro, I like you. You're very creative, but for the life of me, I don't know why you never use references in your artwork. And I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
sorry. And it's kind of like
Really?
Phil Jimenez said also, like, he was giving classes for life drawing for comic
Mm-hmm.
books. So we basically had models come in every week, and we would do life drawings, and he would go over it, and he would show us his own techniques as well. And give us his own advice about the industry. And I guess it's true, like what he says, that when you do something for so long on your own, you kind of develop bad habits that's not just bad for like a more commercial comic, but for an indie comic as an indie creator as well. You kind of have like, you know, just that tunnel vision of doing it one way when doing it from a different perspective could probably help you evolve more or something.
True, because yeah, unless you're told, you may not be aware that you are doing it in a particular way that you're comfortable with, but
Mhm.
maybe not up to standard. And that's the thing. If you're a creator, you really want to look for a job within the industry, and if you're given an opportunity, you kind of have to follow a type of process. But at the same time, though, you don't want to lose your identity. You don't want to lose
Mhm.
who you are as an artist, because you see artists like classic example Bill Sienkiewicz. He went on from doing the house style to creating his own abstract, amazing style.
Yes.
Um, but in saying that, who are your biggest artistic influences? Who's your go to artist for inspiration?
Joe Quesada, like I've always been enamored with his artwork, and
Hmm.
especially I guess because like one of his biggest inspirations himself is Alphonse Mucha, the painter. Like he uses a
Hmm.
lot of those elements, like in his covers and in page designs as well. Like
Hmm.
that's the thing that really caught my attention about his artwork early on, aside from his big influence from Mike Mignola as well. Mike Mignola is another like outstanding artist. I kind of like that kind of realistic but kind of abstract in a sense as well. Like something like Joe
Hmm.
Quesada, Mike Mignola, even John Romita Jr. as well.
Hmm.
He's another artist that I really enjoy. James O'Barr, like again, like I grew up with The Crow, reading The Crow, and of course the movie as well. I
Hmm.
actually had the fortune of meeting him at New York Comic Con.
Nice.
And also, once I was more into anime and manga, of course, Nobuhiro Watsuki, the creator of Rurouni Kenshin, is
Oh
definitely a
yes.
big influence. And also, it's an artist that passed away. His name was Mike Parabek. His career was mostly in the 90s. My
Mhm.
introduction to his artwork was a miniseries for The Elongated Man, and then
Okay.
like where he was starting to get more acclaim was when he did The Fly, when DC Comics had the rights to all the old Archie comics
Mhm.
superheroes. Like
Impact
they had
stuff.
like that line Impact Comics.
Mhm.
So he illustrated The Fly, and that I absolutely loved that comics along with Joe Quesada. That was the comic that made me want to do comics. And then he
Mhm.
started doing Batman the animated series, the comic book adaptation, and
Oh,
that's where
okay.
he was like starting getting recognition and getting nominated for Eisners, and then unfortunately he passed away.
Yeah, no, that's very unfortunate. Um, yeah, but I do appreciate that you go back to these creators. Like you created quite a list there, Alvaro. No, that's amazing.
Yeah, like
Um,
like I was really like neck deep in comics like all my life, like, and again like the creators that I appreciate the most, I always keep them close to me. Like I actually have like a little tower here next to me, for whenever I'm kind of feeling stuck or something, or something is frustrating me, I'll just grab like a graphic novel and I'll start reading like Daredevil or something.
mhm. Nice. And in terms of your creative process, do you have any activities that you do to gain you inspiration? Do you go for walks, or well, what do you do?
Usually I actually listen to a bit of music
Hmm.
beforehand.
Okay.
Like um I grew up in a relatively spiritual kind of family. Of course, my mother Puerto Rican and my father Mexican. They were both Catholics, and even though they weren't practicing Catholics, like they still
Hmm.
had like a Bible with their favorite verse open in the living room and stuff like that, and like
Hmm.
images of saints and Jesus and whatnot. So I always kind of grew up with like that kind of spiritual sensibility, even though I'm not like part of a religion per se. So I just
Hmm.
like take a moment to kind of like meditate a little bit to like calm myself and not let like anything
Mhm.
outside of creativity affect my mind. Like if
Mhm.
something happened in the day job or something
No,
else
of
happened
course.
elsewhere, just kind of like when you go to work, like you leave your home stuff out of work. That's kind of
Mhm.
like I try to approach comics as well, because I don't want it to like influence like in the story, like to put too much of myself or a situation, so where it becomes like the characters are simply avatars for me or something. So I
Mhm.
just kind of like take a few minutes to kind of meditate, relax. I'll put on some rock and roll music depending on what I'm going to work on. Like I'll listen to some Nirvana or Foo Fighters, or if it's I'm going
Mhm.
to do like something more kind of like when I'm going to write for Manuel Carmona, his comic project New Wave.
Mhm.
I'll put on like a different kind of music as well. I've been doing a lot of freelance writing for Puerto Rican artists actually over the last couple of years. So I
Okay.
kind of put like more modern pop music, since it's kind of like appealing more to like a more mainstream audience, even though it's indie. Like they want to be like considered to be like the Marvel DC of Puerto Rico. So I have to go into
Mm.
an entirely different mindset for that as well. But
No,
music is
definitely.
just like the common denominator.
Nice. And talk to me about this title here, DTF6. For people that are unfamiliar, can you like give us a quick synopsis of what the story is about with this title?
Oh yes, of course. DTF6. That's actually an acronym for Delta Team Six. That's the
Mhm.
comic book. Just like I said, that Warlord was kind of like my love letters to superhero comics that I grew up with.
Mhm.
DTF6 is kind of like my love letter to science fiction horror animes that I grew up with, and stuff like X-Men, Battle of the
Mhm.
Planets, also known as G-Force.
Yeah.
All those kind of like 90s teen books, Teen Titans as well, mixed in with a little bit of Neon Genesis Evangelion and
Mhm.
Rasifon and all that good stuff. So it's really a
Definitely.
psychological horror sci-fi action adventure.
Nice. And then speak to us about Clown.
Yes, that's actually one of the more fun ones, and I've taken so long to finish it. It was supposed to be only a four-chapter miniseries, but a lot of things have happened in between doing all these comics, between moving from one place to another, having health issues as well. A
Mhm.
lot of the titles have kind of lagged a bit, so
Yep.
I've been kind of catching up lately now that I'm a little bit more stable with my health as well.
Mhm.
Alfred Gomez's Clown Rogue Assassin. Another one of my good friends from Puerto Rico from that same school. He actually got excited when my other friend and I started doing our own creations. So he kind of hopped in as well, and he started doing his own creations. And we actually developed a deeper friendship over the years, actually. And he created a lot of characters, and we did like crossovers. I would do comic books like in the composition notebooks at school. And
Mhm.
at one point when like we were older, like he was kind of not as much into creating stuff. So he told me like, you just take over my characters, like they're yours. I really don't want them anymore. But I do want to kind of collaborate on this one called Clown. And I was like,
Mhm.
kind of like his last hurrah. I was like,
Mhm.
yeah, definitely. So I wrote the story for him. We kind of brainstormed a little bit. Clown is kind of a spin-off out of Fred Peterson, the Mighty Warlord, because a lot of characters they're in common in both stories. Clown is
Mhm.
this rogue assassin. He's getting paid to basically assassinate other superheroes and other people. And as the story goes along, there's a lot of in this latest case where he's needs to assassinate two people from a superhero team, basically infiltrate them, become one of them, and then assassinate these two characters. He kind of
Mhm.
starts developing feelings for a different character that's on the team. So like there's
Mhm.
a bit of a conflict there. And not to go too much into spoilers, because of that relationship that's starting to bloom, a lot of things come to the light from his employer, from his past, and everything just kind of collides.
Mm-hmm. Okay, sounds really interesting. And how many issues is this one again? Is
It's supposed to be four right now, and I'm in the middle of number two.
okay. Wow, sounds really intriguing. Now that sounds very, very exciting. And then talk to us about Nevermind. So this is through Truthful Comics.
Yes, never mind. That was actually the very first self-published thing I did.
Mm-hmm.
It's essentially an autobiographical web strip. So I
Mm-hmm.
don't know if you're familiar with Tom Beelan's True Story Swear to God. It's essentially kind of like just strips of like slice of life stuff that happens to him that are like so over the top or funny or serious that it couldn't be invented. You just have to like live through it, and he would like just put it on a strip before he did it on a news strip back in
Mm-hmm.
California. And eventually he did his own zines as well. And eventually he published his own comic. Actually, the comic called True Story Swear to God was actually nominated for an Eisner back when it first started out. So I always kind of like those slice of life stories as well, kind of like American Splendor, and
Mm-hmm.
even though it's not necessarily autobiographical, also Optic Nerve as well, which they eventually turn into like two kind of different sets. Like the first half of Optic Nerve were like zines, mini comics, and they made a box set of just that. And then like the other half, which was more of a story called Homecomings, that was published apart as a trade paperback called Homecomings. It's by
Mm-hmm.
Adrian Tome, I believe his name is, and that really kind of influenced me to want to do kind of like a slice of life story. Like I have gone through a lot of ridiculous things in my life, so I was like, I might as well make a comic out of that, and
Yeah.
just
Wow.
kind of deal with it. So that was like the first creator owned thing that I put out there. Again, just to
Mm-hmm.
kind of like test it out, just to see how people would receive it and how comfortable I felt putting my own things out there now that I had this experience doing CF Comics. By that time, unfortunately, that zine division had been shut down because new people entered the organization, and they kind of wanted to do different things. And the creator was kind of feeling a little uncomfortable with the direction that they kind of wanted to take things. So unfortunately, that shuttered down. So I
Mm-hmm.
saw that as an opportunity of like, well, I might as well try this out and do this. And I started to do those web strips in a forum and in a
Mm-hmm.
message board. And for those who are not old enough to know what a message board is, just think of a very primitive Discord, like where you had like different rooms where that they were called boards at the time with different topics,
Mm-hmm.
different themes, different administrators
Yeah.
working on
Okay.
those message boards. And I was in a forum of Puerto Rican comics, and there was a subsection for creatives, and that's where I started uploading the strips for Nevermind. And so many people started reading it that other people started doing their own web comics too, until eventually they made their own web comic subsection on that forum.
And did you collaborate with anyone in Nevermind, or is this like 100% self-made?
Yeah, this one was 100% self-made. I even printed a very low run of it to sell at conventions and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, back then, there weren't that many options to save files.
Yeah.
It's not like everywhere, like even your watch can have a cloud now to save things. Back then, if you could only save it on your hard drive on a floppy
Mhm.
disk, and if you
Yeah.
wanted to be fancy on a burn it on a CD. So a lot of those original art files, they got lost because of a power surge that I had back in Puerto Rico at home. And
Yeah.
also during that power surge was during a storm, because Puerto Rico is like right on the line for tropical storms and hurricanes. So the house actually got flooded in one of those storms. When we got back from my aunt's house, where we like kind of spent to, stay safe from the storm and whatnot, the
Mm.
whole house was flooded. So all
Oh,
that artwork, like
yeah.
including the original artwork for Fred Peterson, the Mighty Warlord, and the Sea of Comic stuff, all
Oh
that
no.
was lost. So actually the cover for that one is like the reprint of those original 12 strips, because last year I actually got COVID.
Mm-hmm.
So I was taking a long time. Even now I'm still kind of recovering from some of the effects. And one day I was just like languishing, looking around my emails to like kind of transfer artwork into a different drive that I have, a hard disk drive that I have separate now, because I
Mm-hmm.
learned my lessons from back then. I actually
Yeah.
found a PDF file that I had used to print the original 12
Mm-hmm.
strips. So I
Okay.
decided to like, again, kind of like to test the waters now to see if people would actually read it now. I went
Mm-hmm.
ahead and took those PDF files and I ripped them apart on Photoshop. I made them with a better definition so that people could understand the lettering better, since everything was hand done at the time. And when I say hand done, I mean like traditionally done, like traditional lettering, traditional inking, and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
And at least I thought that it didn't look as good in the original run. So I just took advantage and I just made some things clearer and the
Mm-hmm.
images a little bigger, a little crisper as well, using filters so that it can be more distinguishable. And I just put it out there with a new cover, and people actually really started liking it. So I decided to do a True Full Comics edition, which is me just redrawing and relettering everything from scratch, only digitally this time.
Mm. Yeah, because I really like the cover. It has that hand sketch, like that hand sketch feel to it, and it looks imperfect, but in some ways perfect, if you know what I mean.
Oh yeah, like and that's actually digitally also, that one, that cover. Like I kind of
Mm.
wanted to pay my respects to the comics that got destroyed in that flood. So
Yeah,
I just
no,
wanted to keep
definitely.
it like within that same vibe, and also because even though sometimes I do like the borderline commercial stuff, like when I write for Manuel's project New Wave, or when I
Mhm.
freelance write for other people, I still want to have my indie roots out there, because that's what I love the most, to be honest. And actually, like
Mhm.
going back to Fred Peterson, the Mighty Warlord, like 90% of the readers have told me that it's the only superhero comic book they read, only because it's so different from the traditional superhero comics that they
Mhm.
have read before. Because Warlord, I've always very purposely had it like that thin line between indie and just commercial enough, and just indie enough,
No, fair
hopefully.
enough. It's a good balance, that's for sure. And here's the other cover of Nevermind.
Yes, that's for the remaster version. As I say, that's where the ones that I completely redrew and completely relettered as well. Um,
Mhm.
like I was actually very surprised. Like a lot of people really liked reading that version as well, because I also kind of streamlined the writing too, because the writing was a little bit clunky, at least in my opinion. um, because I was like starting off as a writer back then, so I wanted to kind of improve on some situations where the story could have been a little bit more clearer, whether in the writing or in the storytelling and the art as well.
That looks great. And then we'll move on to Project New Wave. So I know Manny's a good friend of mine. How did this project come about?
That's interesting, because that also started in the message board forums as well in Puerto Rico. He had
Hmm.
just gotten into that forum because slowly other creators were like discovering that message board, and word of mouth would get along and people would find it. And he actually joined that message board. He put pages of issue number one, because he had like drawn issue number one since back then, like since like 2007, 2008. But
Mm-hmm.
the problem is that Manuel really doesn't consider himself a writer. So that entire first issue, he just literally illustrated it with just like kind of like story beats of what he wanted to happen, but he
Mm-hmm.
had no idea of like how to do the dialogue or transition from one scene to another. And at
Mm-hmm.
that point, he was going to collaborate with a writer to help him sort it out, but
Mm-hmm.
things fell through. And he actually discovered Fred Peterson, the Mighty Warlord, on that forum, and he really enjoyed it. And we just kind of started talking and hitting it off. And I was actually about to suggest him like if he needed a writer, like I could definitely help him. And just before I typed that to him, he sent me a message saying, "Hey, I need help with a writer. Would you be interested?" So like it was like, it was kind of meant to be. So
No.
we ended up meeting up in Borders. And again, for those people that aren't old enough to know what Borders was, it was kind of like the competition to Barnes and Nobles. It was this big bookstore that also sold DVDs, music, had a
Mm-hmm.
cafe and whatnot, and they would sell like wholesale and whatnot. So we met at that cafe. I had written a first draft based on that, those pages that he had illustrated, and a first draft of another story as well. And he read them both like right in front of me. And my friend at the time, actually the one that had created the character Clown, like he was the
Mm-hmm.
one that actually gave me a ride to the mall to that border. So it was just the both of us sitting there watching him read stuff. And it's the first time I actually had somebody read something in front of me. So I was so nervous. Like I don't usually get very nervous, but
Mm-hmm.
that made me nervous, to like see somebody reading a draft right in front of you. And
Yeah.
a long story short, he really liked it. Um, so I helped him with the story for issue one with the dialogue, and then
Mm-hmm.
issue two was actually supposed to be issue number five because there was going to be more action packed stories, but he really enjoyed that story so much that I had written that was going to be issue five, which was kind of supposed to be kind of like the breather after a lot of stuff had happened and kind of like
Mm-hmm.
be a little bit more introspective and show kind of like how each character, their personalities work one off another. Like he
Mm-hmm.
actually decided to bump that to issue two instead.
Nice. Yeah, because I did find that the dialogue was actually pretty decent in these books. And
Yes.
what did it feel like? So just take us in the writing process. You're writing someone else's work. Um, what did that feel like, and how was the collaboration between yourself and Manny?
It was intimidating at first because Manuel also was a student from the Joe Kubert School.
Mm-hmm.
So it was like, um, I'm here with this very talented person. He's somebody that actually studied under the Kuberts. Like he actually even met Greg Capullo at the time that he gave like a talk at the school, like before when Capullo was still doing Spawn actually.
Mm-hmm.
So that was definitely intimidating because I didn't want to write something that would be like below his standard of art, below his quality of art, like
Mm-hmm.
I may sound biased because I've known him for so long, but like
Of
I do
course.
think his art is so outstanding. And also the colorist Francisco Rivera, we all knew each other from Puerto Rico too, so it's like kind of like a really good tight knit team, like almost the family. Like Manuel and I just say we're brothers, really. So
Nah.
it was intimidating at first, especially since it was the first time I was actually writing a script for someone else to illustrate.
Yeah, no, that's very very true. No, that's so good. Tell us about your next story here, Stupid the Cat. Ain't it
Um,
right?
that one is kind of like, again, like one of those little projects that I do to kind of keep in the process of doing things, and also to like,
Mm-hmm.
keep those indie roots fresh as well, because for like every kind of mainstream-ish thing I do, I also like to balance that out with doing something more low key, more mini comic throwback to the zines as well. And
Mm-hmm.
Stupid the Cat is essentially like like again, like Warlord is a love letter to superheroes, DTF 6 to anime, science fiction, horror. This is essentially like my love letter to Garfield and Heathcliff and kind of all of those kind of like animal morning cartoons, but a little bit kind of edgy, kind of like that. Oh, I'm blanking out on that cartoon from the 90s that it was this gray cat also. It'll come to me later, but
Oh,
like
great.
he was on Fox Kids and whatnot.
No, no, not Eek the cat.
Yes, Eek the cat. Actually, it
Eek
was.
the
Yeah.
cat, yeah. I remember Eek the cat from a long time ago. Far out.
So that's essentially like strips of this cat just kind of um not as over the top as like having him be like this extreme figure or whatnot, almost like a human, but just kind of like very cat like in a sense of like seeing things through like kind of his eyes, kind of like when the cat sees a laptop open and he's on the laptop, he's just like thinking, oh, I love this cat heating device, and things like that. It's
Yeah.
just something to have fun with. A lot of people actually had a lot of fun with it too. Stupid the
Hmm.
cat just came because actually in that private school, one of our classes did like this mock student newspaper for an assignment. And of course, since I was the comic book guy that would always be drawing, everyone just kind of like pointed their fingers at me like, you're in charge of the comic book section. Like, okay. And so I just like, since I was like short on time, I just like took that concept of Garfield and Heathcliff and be like, okay, this is a cat. It's done in a stupid fast time, so I'm just gonna call it Stupid the Cat. That's
Nah.
pretty much it just kind of stuck with me throughout the years afterwards.
Hmm. And how many issues are available of Stupid the Cat?
Oh, right now one.
Just
Unfortunately,
one?
that one
Okay.
also went through the thing where a lot of the original artwork got destroyed.
Oh.
So this one I actually had to remake the first couple of strips because fortunately I did have like the majority of them still with me.
Hmm.
So at the very least I was able to do kind of like a compromise and redo the first couple of strips and then just publish the others in a good quality print because I could have done what like some people advised me to do, which is just take the internet images, blow them up, and have it be
Hmm.
printed out. But
Yeah.
I have seen my some colleagues do that. In my opinion, it looks so kind of blurry that it
That's
kind of
true.
takes away from the, at least from my experience, and I wouldn't want my readers to maybe like have less of experience reading my material if things are like blurry and pixelated because it's pretty
Hmm.
obviously that was blown up to um, the resolution to be able to be printed.
Yeah, well, that's true because you try to save it. I get it because it's work that you've done, but then again, you take it away what the readers will see. They will see something that isn't quite up to standard, and they don't know what happened to the original artwork. But I mean, in saying that, though, that's something you should frame, right? That's my opinion. You put that up on a frame or something.
Yeah, exactly.
It has story behind it, for what it's been through. Um, so let's go back to the Mighty Warlord here. So how many stories have you written for this book so far, or this
Uh,
ongoing saga?
well, script wise, I have the whole saga already written out because it's something that I've been working on since middle school. So I
Hmm.
actually know how it's going to end. In fact, when I started doing it in middle school, it was kind of like in the middle of the saga where all the characters were introduced because again it was kind of like this back and forth with my other friend doing like these war stories against each other. Like actually that's what it was called, the super cyber wars, in case you
Hmm.
were curious. So like when I started writing the stories, they were all pretty much introduced. The story was like in full swing when decided to actually like sit down and write out the story, and I wrote it out all the way until the end, and I actually
Mhm.
have it right here. Like I actually also did comic books in notebooks where the entire saga is that I did all throughout high school,
Oh
and I
wow.
actually still have them. Like I always carry them with me. Like they're like 10 notebooks. I'm just killing my figures right now. But it's like these kind of notebooks.
Wow.
Like the entire saga is
Can you
written
open
there.
one up and show me?
Oh yes, of course. Like like I actually have
Oh,
some YouTube videos and TikTok videos where I show a lot of the artwork inside. Like let me show because again a lot of these have like spoilers, so
mhm.
I just
Oh yeah, it
have to be
doesn't
like
show me the spoilers, but
like since it's all done in pencil, I don't know how well it's going
mhm.
to be seen.
I mean, it can see a bit of it. It's just got you got the glare of the light, but
Yeah, maybe I can see if
oh yes, I can see that. Oh yeah, wow.
so. This was in 2000. This was issue number 47, actually.
Mm-hmm. Whoa.
So I had like that whole saga written out, and when I decided that I wanted to actually self-publish it, then I found myself with the problem was like, okay, I know the story, my friends know the story, they read it and loved it, but no one else has ever read it, and they're going to
Mhm.
be super confused if I started the way I originally started it. So I had to like go back into the drawing board and kind of like write like flesh out the actual origin of these characters so that people wouldn't get lost when they read it, because they're not going to like see my mind what's everything that's happened to them and where they're
Yes.
going from there. Like they need to see how everything started. So I definitely had to like go back and like write a lot of things to start it off like properly with an
Mhm.
origin and introducing characters slowly and whatnot. And then when that happened, I would have to like sometimes alter stories from the future as well so that everything could, yes, be kind of seamless. So it's kind
Mhm.
of almost like J.K. Rowling's with Harry Potter in a way where she actually wrote the last book first and then she like
Mhm.
worked her way towards there.
Yeah. Wow. No, isn't that crazy? But I appreciate the fact that you're able to identify that, it can be confusing to people who've never read your work before, because I had the same problem when I was creating my first book as well. So I know what I was telling myself, but other people may not see it exactly the same way. So,
Yeah,
there's kudos to you. Like, I appreciate what you do because you identified something that, you said your friends would know exactly what it is you're talking about, but people looking in wouldn't have a
yeah.
clue. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's
No,
a good thing I did that too, because of that is why I've gotten other opportunities to write freelance comics, especially in Puerto Rico. A lot of the times that I get contacted to do that freelance work is actually to do introductions to characters and origin stories, because they're
Mhm.
either stuck in it or they had presented these characters in previous issues, but their character weren't fleshed out enough, and they
Yeah.
would just like write to me like, I need help, I read your comic, I need help, and like, let's go to it.
No, nice. I appreciate that. It's so good, man. And that's the thing about indie comics. We're not competitors. Kind of are, but we are not like we're not afraid to help each other out. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
And that's
exactly.
that's the importance of our industry.
Yeah, it's if anything, it's more like a friendly competition where you're
Mm,
willing to help each other out, but at the same time, like at least talking for myself, if I see a colleague or a friend do something that's very cool, I'm like, I have to up my game and kind of like make something cool
mhm.
myself, like not to like compete with him, but because I want to elevate my own creativity in my own way as
Exactly.
well. and hopefully
Yeah.
inspire other colleagues or other people to like, elevate their things too.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm going to ask you some wrap up questions now. Um, what part of you, Alvaro, will people find in your work? What part of you do we see in each and every comic that you've made?
A little bit of everything, to be honest, because I always do put a little bit of myself into what I write.
Mhm.
For example, with Fred Peterson, a lot of people have, especially the people that know me, have said like, he's kind of you, isn't he? I'm like, kind of yes and no. Like, he's kind of like an idealized version, I guess, of myself, of how I would
Mhm.
have probably been like if I were younger and not as introverted. But I also
Mhm.
wanted to give him the flaws that I had back then and flaws that I still have now too, because I don't want him to, like I said earlier, I don't want these characters to just be avatars of what I
Of course.
am. I want to like try to make it as relatable as possible to other people as well.
Mhm. No, that's very important. Um, what music do you listen to?
I listen to a lot of music, although I really do concentrate on rock and roll music. Even when I was
Mhm.
a little kid, like I was a very old soul, even as a little kid. Like growing up, people were like into MC Hammer,
Yeah.
Poison, Guns N' Roses. I was listening to the Beatles, John Denver, Aerosmith, Led Zeppelin, and I still do. And Aerosmith is still like my all-time favorite band. But
Yeah.
as decades go by, like for example, when I first started doing Warlord, Nirvana and grunge came out. So when I worked more on my own stuff, that's kind of what I listened to the most, like kind of like that
Mhm.
grungy era. Also, depending on the story as well. If it's like a heavy story, I'll listen to like hard rock. If it's more of a softer story, then I'll probably listen to more something more like pop music or something more like Cheryl Crow or something like that.
Nice. No, it's a good mix of music. I mean, I'm a music lover myself, so it's nice that I'm not the only one that has got an old soul as well.
Yes.
Um, what have you watched lately? Have you streamed anything? Any cool movies on Netflix? What have you watched?
I'm usually like super busy, so I'm like, I know it's kind of almost like a cliche at this point that I'm
Hmm.
super busy. That I haven't even watched all the Marvel movies yet.
Oh
But
wow.
but I do like make time to watch stuff, especially with my girlfriend also. Uh,
Hmm.
when I want to distress, like a lot of times we also watch Broadway shows.
Hmm.
Um,
Oh nice.
when the Batman came out, we actually both saw it 4 times already in the theater.
You say
Because
you saw the Batman 4 times?
yeah, it's like my girlfriend, like she's a geek also. She's actually
Okay.
more into manga and anime and
Hmm.
more on the indie comic side as well. So it was
Hmm.
actually kind of a surprise that she wanted to see it. And when she watched it with me, like she actually loved it. And she actually called out a few things like saying like, this scene kind of looks like something out of that Scott Snyder Greg Capullo comic that you love so much. I'm like, yes.
Wow, wow. Kudos to your missus. Wow, that's amazing. And what's next for you? What's next for Alvaro? I mean, do you have more of the Mighty Warlord coming out? What's coming out? What's coming out soon without giving away too many spoilers?
Oh yes, of course. The same with Nevermind and Stupid the Cat. I'm also redrawing all those early chapters of Fred Peterson, the Mighty Warlord. So I am going to be republishing them as I call it the Truthful Comics edition, because back
Nice.
then when I actually did have print versions of Warlord, I was collaborating with a different colleague, mutual colleague of ours back in Puerto Rico, and then we kind of like went our separate ways because of creative differences and whatnot. And that's when Manuel kind of like came in and said like, hey, I'm not really doing stuff with anyone, you're not really doing stuff with anyone, let's get together. And we formed Truthful Comics for like this is going to be the 11th year now that we have
Yeah.
Truthful Comics.
Wow. Wow. That's amazing.
So I'm definitely going to print trade paperbacks with all new artwork for Fred Peterson, the Mighty Warlord. I'm also
Mhm.
working on a horror comic book that's called Hell Beneath You. That one is going to be a love letter to all the horror movies I grew up watching with my family as a
Mhm.
little kid, because my first love really was actually horror. Like, my mother really loves horror movies. Like, not so much over the last couple of years. People sometimes mellow out a little bit and
Yeah.
change, but like she would literally watch horror movies while she was pregnant with me. So I was literally hearing horror movies from the womb. So
She's probably hoping like the process of giving birth won't be as scary as what she's watching.
exactly.
Oh my goodness gracious me. Oh
so
man, that is so great. So great.
so Hell Beneath You is basically going to be like my homage to Stephen King, the aforementioned Scott Snyder,
Mhm.
with the more horror indie stories that he does as well. It's basically a love letter to the Halloween movies, John Carpenter.
John Carpenter for sure.
So
The
that's
God.
going to be like an 8-issue miniseries that hopefully will start being published by the fall.
Definitely, and please, when you do create these amazing titles, reach out to us at Think Indie Pod. We'd love to talk about them or even share them amongst the greater community, because it's all about indie comics here at Think Indie. So really, Alvaro, thank you so much for joining us today, or joining me, and and please, don't be a stranger. Reach out to us again.
Oh yes, of course. It was my pleasure. And as Dan said in the previous podcast as well, thank you for creating this space as well, because like spaces like this are far in between on
Mhm.
Facebook, on Twitter, on YouTube. So it's just great to be able to find a place to just have like a conversation with you like this.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I appreciate that. Thank you. And I just want to thank everyone for watching Thinking the Extra from Comic Crusaders. Please click like and subscribe for more amazing content. And also go to comiccrusaders.com. This is Dodgy from Thinking the Extra. See you all next time.
Thank you. We hope you've enjoyed this Comic Crusaders production. For real-time news on all things pop culture, please feel free to follow us on social media. For articles, original content, merchandise, and more, please go to www.comiccrusaders.com. Also follow along with all of the websites in the Comic Crusaders family. As always, if you like this content, please click like and subscribe to the Comic Crusaders YouTube channel.